Hello, everyone. My name is Yulia Ivaniuk-Squires, and I'm the coordinator of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dana peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the Center's lecture series. Please note that our discussion is being video recorded and will be posted on our YouTube page later on. If you'd like to follow our videos and lectures, you can subscribe to the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies on YouTube. Also, feel free to submit your questions into the chat box throughout the conversation, or you can also raise a hand during the Q&A, and I'll be happy to call on you. The theme of our webinar today is Sovietization of History and Memory in Ukraine during 1920s-30s by Dr. Oksana Klymenko. Dr. Oksana Klymenko is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba, and she's also a senior lecturer of history at the History Department at the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy. She was a visiting scholar at Stanford University, the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, and the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Her primary research interests concerned the Ukrainian history of the 20th century, Soviet society, memory studies, and gender studies. Currently, she's writing a monograph about the Soviet version of history of the Dnipro-Has, Zaporizhia in 1930s. And this study is an interdisciplinary study and focuses on the Soviet techniques of constructing collective and individual memory, the role of propaganda in the USSR, and the formation of the new man and woman image. Also this year, she's working on her research project on Ukrainian temporarily displaced persons in Austria, their activities, rights, and responsibilities. And Oksana, without further ado, the floor is yours, and I really look forward to this discussion.
Good afternoon. I'm so glad to present my speech today. So now I will share my presentation. It works, yeah? Okay. So topic of my presentation is Sovietization of history and memory in Ukraine in 1920s, 1930s. During the 10 years of the war, we could repeatedly see how Russia creates fake narratives, falsifying the history of Ukraine. But the transformation of history into a tool of propaganda was characteristic of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, in particular the Soviet Union. In this presentation, I will consider two Bolshevik campaigns during the 1920s and 1930s that played a crucial role in implementing Soviet control of Ukrainian territories and overshadowing Ukraine's national history. These campaigns focus on the history of the October Revolution and the history of factories and plants. These two campaigns are very similar in terms of organizations and the tasks they were supposed to accomplish. Furthermore, specifically created commissions responsible for writing Soviet history laid the foundation for subsequent practices in constructing Soviet history in Ukraine. The analysis of these two campaigns will demonstrate the mechanism and the tasks of Sovietization of history. The Sovietization of history is a term historians use to describe the methods to establish a correct Soviet-endorsed version of history. First, I would like to talk about 1917. 1917 was declared by the Bolsheviks as a pivotal moment in their history. After seizing power in Petrograd and subsequently in other territories that later become part of the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks faced the need to define a new, distinct reinterpretation of history. This reinterpretation was proposed by Mikhail Pokrovsky and other Marxist historians, with its foundation based on social class rather than national identity. The work of these Marxist historians and the teaching of history in schools was focused on explaining the significance and role of class struggle and the October Revolution as both its culmination and starting point. In the 1930s were marked by the Stalinization of science, including historical science. One of the ideologies of the subsequent campaign dedicated to writing the history of factories and plants in 1930s, Maxim Gorky claimed, "We need to know everything that happened in the past, but not as it has already been told, but as it's illuminated by the teachings of Marx, Lenin, Stalin." At the time, Stalin already controlled the writing of history textbooks and the multi-volume history of the Civil War, and actively made amendments on film scripts, including those with historical themes, transforming them into so-called ideologically correct narratives. Also, toward the end of the 1920s and the beginning of 1930s was the introduction of industrialization. This was accompanied by a large-scale propaganda campaign, which was primarily focused on the construction of socialism. Changes in the economic system, namely the intensive implementation of industrialization in the second half of the 1920s, necessitated the writing of history of industrial facilities, especially those built during the first five-year plan. At the same time, Soviet methods of rewriting history were not unique, but rather reflected general tendencies inherent to the era. Crafting one's own so-called true history was one of the principal tasks faced by political forces that came to power in the newly formed states after the First World War. European authoritarian and totalitarian regimes widely used history as a political tool for legitimizing power, shaping a new society, cultivating a new man, and so on. Mussolini's fascist regime appealed to the glorious past of ancient Rome. Nazi ideologies glorified the superiority of the Aryan race, while simultaneously referencing recent defeats, including in the First World War, for the purpose of spreading revengeful sentiments. During the period of the Second Polish Republic, under the rule of Józef Pilsudski, the Jagiellonian idea spread a reference to the time of the Jagiellonian dynasty as the best period of the monarchy. The question of constructing one's own history in totalitarian states was closely related to the issue of legitimizing their power and establishing control over all spheres of life. Now I would like to tell about the project on writing the history of October Revolution. A special commission, Commission on the History of the October Revolution and the Communist Party, was founded in 1920 to communise time and space in these territories where the Bolsheviks established their authority. It collected documents and accounts of those who took part in revolutionary events, organized so-called evenings of memoirs, published so-called historical texts, arranged exhibitions, and created archives. When we talk about its part, we should mention terms like memory project. It's used to denote activities aimed at constructing a memory of important events in Soviet history. This term was introduced by Frederick Corney in his research regarding the October Revolution. Corney characterized the memoirs of the October Revolution collected in the 1920s as the first Soviet memory project. He pointed out that it was implemented not only through the campaign of collecting memoirs by the revolution's participants, but also by visual means, including the renaming of streets and squares throughout the USSR, the creating of buildings and squares on the October anniversary, the holding of demonstrations, and the staging of performances that illustrated the course of the revolution. In 1921, the Commission on the History of the October Revolution and the Communist Party was established in the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, All Ukrainian is part. The commission included Grigory Petrovsky, Stanislav Kosior, and others. Mykola Skripnik became the head of All Ukrainian is part in 1921. The main editorial office created and coordinated a network of local editorial offices, also known as commissions, including state and regional. The mission of the All Ukrainian is part was the same as in the Soviet Union overall, collecting documents and personal narratives, as well as their publications. However, their substantive content differed. ISPAT aimed to show that a socialist transformation had taken place everywhere. This served to legitimize the Bolshevik power in Ukraine. One particular aspect of the October Revolution in Ukrainian territories was the struggle of the Bolsheviks not only against the provisional government, but also against the Ukrainian Central Rada, Central Council. So here we see picture of the building where Central Rada located. Starting the activities of ISPART, we found that the goal of this commission in the Ukrainian territories was the falsification of history and the so-called forgetting of the Ukrainian Revolution, transforming it into a component of the concept of the civil war in Russia, rejecting any mention of Ukrainian independence and the national movement. The All Ukrainian is part organized events similar to those of the All Union is part. Following the example of the Moscow exhibition, local exhibitions and museums were organized. In 1922, the Kyiv Sport Department organized an exhibition titled From Revolutionary Workers' Circles through Social Democracy to the Communist Dictatorship of the Proletariat. The following year, the same department prepared an exhibition on the history of the party and the revolutionary movement, covering the period from Pugachev's rebellion through 1917. Episodic exhibitions were also organized coinciding with revolutionary holidays and anniversaries. In particular, the celebration of anniversaries of the 19th century Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko was a distinctive feature of the All Ukrainian is part work, which also cultivated the image of Shevchenko as a revolutionary. Celebrating revolutionary holidays was intended to demonstrate the resilience of the revolutionary movement in territories where the October Revolution took place. The All Ukrainian is part published the Chronicle of the Revolution starting in 1922, in anticipation of the 5th anniversary of the October Revolution. It was tasked with demonstrating that the October Revolution had encompassed all Ukrainian territories. The journal published Bolsheviks' memoirs of revolutionary events throughout Ukrainian territories. Kharkiv, Kyiv, Donbas, Katerinoslav, Mykolaiv, Poltava region, Chernihiv region, and so on. Bolshevik memoirs of revolutionary events in Ukrainian territories were also published in separate collections. So here we can see how this collection fold, and we see that it's again about different cities in Ukraine. These publications aim to demonstrate widespread support for Bolshevik ideas among the people in all Ukrainian territories. The publication of memoirs specifically aimed to substantiate the truthfulness of this claim. However, these memoirs were constructed and verified by ISPART following special created instructions. Central ISPART created instructions on how to write memoirs. For example, the basic outline for memoirs by Nikolai Baturin was published in 1921. Most questions were related to the character of the Bolshevik organization's work. In 1925, entire methodological essays on what and how to write memoirs were published. The most important of which was How to Write Memoirs by ISPART member Joseph Gelis, published in the Journal of Central ISPART, Proletarskaya Revolution. Gelis severely criticized memoirs in which the author spoke a lot about himself or herself, Such memoirs mostly do not reflect reality, but serve to put the central person in a favorable light. These memoirs are harmful to the younger generation as they influence and hypnotize them. This phrase is not just about the topic, the style of memoirs. It's about characteristics of Soviet people. They shouldn't be individualists. They should be participants of a group of people, a collectivity. Next method of collecting memoirs was so-called evenings of memoirs. The commission gathered a particular group of workers and they had to tell their stories, which were then transcribed. It's worth noting that the theme of evenings of memoirs, which were organized by ISPART in Ukraine, for example, in February of 1923, the Podil ISPART department organized evenings of memoirs in several districts dedicated to the 5th anniversary of the uprising against Petlura in Podillia. So this is a vivid example of how Soviet propaganda created a negative image of those who participated in the national movement. Next method of preserving memoirs and ensuring accurate recollection of historical events involves the completion of questionnaires by participants in revolutionary events. In 1926, the previous part department distributed a printed copy of the questionnaire for participants of the October Revolution and the civil war in Kyiv, Kyiv region, and other cities. In terms of their format, the questionnaires were somewhat similar to the autobiographies that Soviet citizens began writing in the 1920s. In Olena Styashkina research on materials from the Donbas region, ways in which the average person constructed their past in autobiographies were identified, including searches for so-called correct origins, emphasis on poverty, and so on. Filling out questionnaires was also a kind of lesson that taught respondents how to construct and present one's past, since formulating questions in certain way implied providing expected answers and avoiding unwanted topics. One of the main goals of the survey was to teach people to perceive, believe, and demonstrate their belief that the October Revolution was the main event in the narrator's life, which changed their life for the better. In the 1920s, Ukrainian people perceived the events of 1917 in different ways, and there were still no correct answers to the questions. As Olena Styashkina notes, the October Revolution is not presented as a decisive phenomenon in the autobiography she analyzed. It's necessary to admit that activities of ISPART were large-scale, but also it had a lot of problems. For example, ISPART didn't have enough finances and resources to realize most plans. Also, very often, people refused to work at ISPART local departments, refused to write or tell their stories. So we can notice that in 1920s, such commissions like ISPART didn't have opportunities to force people to present their memoirs. However, ISPART activities demonstrated the mechanism of Sovietization of history. Moreover, one of the key tasks of ISPART was indeed accomplished, namely the falsification of Ukrainian history and dissemination of the Soviet version. The ISPART activities in the 1920s in the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic led to the revision of the past and the creation of correct approaches of treating history, specifically the events of 1917 through 1921. The Ukrainian Revolution had to be correctly included in the Bolshevik concept of civil war in Russia, and Ukrainian political actors were deemed so-called enemies of the revolution. The next Soviet campaign to rewrite history took place in 1930s and was a part of the process of the Stalinization of history. So conducting scholarly research according to the concept introduced by Stalin. In 1931, Proletarsky Revolution published a letter by Stalin titled "On Several Questions of the History of Bolshevism." With this article, Stalin expressed expressed his dissatisfaction with the state of affairs on the so-called historical front. This publication served as a demonstration of the subordination of historical science not only to the party, but directly to the leader who determines the so-called correctness of historical research and the fate of historians. The propaganda campaign that ensued after Stalin's letter marked the beginning of rewriting history based on the so-called axioms of Bolshevism, where the key role was assigned to the principle of so-called class struggle. In 1931, a new historical project was announced, writing the history of industrial enterprises in the Soviet Union. To this end, a commission on the history of factories and plants was established by the Central Committee of the Communist Party, the head of which was the proletarian writer Maxim Gorky. Yevhen Dobrenko notes that during this period, Gorky's life was engulfed in a true historymania. Various large-scale efforts to rewrite history were organized at his initiative. So we can see that history of factories, history of the Civil War, of sites, villages, urban culture, and so on. Johann Halbach refers to Gorky as a writer inclined towards Nietzscheanism, as he believed that the revolution would mark the beginning of creating a new social order, where the heroic essence of humanity would be liberated, allowing for a new way of life. Maxim Gorky called for writing of the history of factories, explaining that understanding the present is possible only through comparison, where more precisely through the contrast with the past. Gorky also justifies the need to know the past with the necessity to resist external enemies, so-called capitalist world. Everything that needs to be known is also because although the capitalist world is decaying and decomposing in its death throes, it can still strike at the Soviet Union. The threat of enemies at the time became a common practice in all spheres of activity in the USSR. In particular, historian Sheila Fitzpatrick emphasizes that the creation of enemies and then suspecting them of comparing against the state was a common practice of Soviet power. Writing the history of factories and plants, as Gorky asserted, should have been done by the workers. Gorky said that the workers created the plant. They should write the history of its creation, the history of their work. The working people must know everything they do. They must know their history. Gorky emphasized that by working and writing, the worker creates a new world and a new man. Creating the new man through labor was one of the Gorky's main ideas, which emerged long before the start of the campaign to write the history of factories. In his publications of 1917-1918, he wrote about the role of work in human life. Our salvation lies in work, and we will find joy in work. The world is created not by words, but by deeds. This is said beautifully and is an indisputable truth. Work done with love becomes creativity. If only people learn to love their work, everything else would fall into place. Gorky actively developed the idea of work as art in the 1930s. At the first All-Union Congress of Soviet Writers in 1934, he presented it as follows. The main character of our books should be labor. That is, a person organized by labor processes, armed with all the power of modern technology, a person who in turn makes work easier, more productive, raising it to the level of art. We must learn to understand work as creativity. Based on the constructions of the chief editorial board on how to write the history of factories and plants, published in Pravda in November of 1931, the following objectives for writing the history of factories and plants can be identified. The first task was to legitimize Soviet power. Only by comparing the present with the past could be the October Revolution. Could the October Revolution be justified as the only possible way of liberating the proletariat from the power of the bourgeois? In historical narratives of factories that operated since the time of the Russian Empire, their decline during the bourgeois imperial past was to be contrasted with the so-called rapid development after the October Revolution. The second task was to demonstrate the superiority of the Soviet system over the capitalist one. The history of factories built during the first five-year plan was to present a narrative where the establishment of new industrial facilities and their transformation into so-called world giants would signify the superiority of the Soviet Union over the capitalist world. The third task was to educate the new man who loves his work, actively contributes to the well-being of his collective, and appropriately remembers the history of the state, the collective, and their own history. The Commission on the History of Factories and Plants implemented this task by working on several fronts, which were also characteristic of the work of the All-Ukrainian East Part and All-Ukrainian Commission on Writing the History of Factories. The third task involved collecting archival materials which were later used to organize exhibitions. The second task included gathering the recollection of workers. The third task was the writing of historical descriptions of specific plans by local commissions. These writings were then edited by state and central commissions before finally being published. Unlike its part, which included party activists and historians, the commissions on the history of factories primarily consisted of writers and very often workers. The involvement of writers in the effort to write the history of factories was facilitated by the establishment of the Union of Writers of the USSR in 1932. The main editorial board of the History of Factories published its methodological recommendations, workers' memoirs, and historical descriptions of industrial enterprises in the History of Factories journal. Between 1932 and 1934, 12 issues of this journal were released. In 1932, in Kharkiv, the All-Ukrainian Editorial Office of the History of Factories and Plants issued a list of industrial facilities for which history essays should be written. So this included, we see that Kharkiv locomotive plant, Lenin coal mine in Kyiv, Petrovsky plant, Dnipro-HES, Horlivka mining district, and so on. Most of these factories and plants, specifically all except Dnipro-HES, Dnipro hydroelectric power station, were founded before 1917. Therefore, the emphasis of the essays was placed on the turning point, the October Revolution, after which workers purportedly liberated themselves from slavery and took control of the plant mine, leading to the prosperity. The All-Ukrainian Editorial Office of the History of Factories and Plants became the Ukrainian Worker Publishing House, while the Journal of the History of Factories published by the main editorial office was not issued in the Ukrainian Republic. Therefore, unlike the case of writing the history of October 1917, where the All-Ukrainian East Part had its periodic publication, the All-Ukrainian Editorial Office of the History of Factories did not create such a publication. The reason for this lay in the centralization of the work of the network of Republican and local departments of the Commission on the History of Factories, which were supposed to follow the instructions provided above, incorporating the histories of specific factories into the all-union context without emphasizing territorial differences. The directions of work for commissions at all levels were supposed to be the same. Manuscripts on the history of plans prepared by members of local commissions were to be verified and coordinated with the main editorial office in Moscow. If spreading the myth of the socialist revolution in Ukraine was paramount for its part, then the activities of the Commission on the History of Factories were aimed at educating the people to believe in the socialist present, publicly demonstrating their faith, and encouraging greater involvement in labor processes. The primary tool for accomplishing this task became so-called evenings of memoirs. Evenings of memoirs aim to collect information from the workers and encourage them further achievements. The evenings of memoirs, like a political word, should be a certain way direct our working masses for further labor activity, increase socialist competition, develop and improve the quality of plan operations so that our memories of past heroic days serve as a means of mobilizing to improve further to performance to our enterprise. The main narrative of the evenings of memoirs was the glorification of industrialization, the socialist system, and the overall life of workers in Soviet Union. Stephen Kotkin admitted that for workers it was important to demonstrate the faith in socialist construction, but it was not necessary to believe. So after reading different transcripts of evenings of memoirs, I would like to say that style of workers' stories could be influenced by both propaganda and repressions. In 1930s were a time when people were learning to speak like Bolsheviks and understood how their past could influence their future. It worth noting that this campaign took place in the first half of the 1930s, during a time of Ukraine of repression of the intelligentsia, collectivization, and the Holodomor of 1932-1933, resulting in millions of deaths. In contrast, during the 1930s, discussing or disseminating information about the famine was prohibited, and the Soviet version of history constructed during that period celebrated the so-called economic achievements of the Soviet Union and its superiority over the so-called capitalist world. And the campaign to write the history of factories and plants was one of the ways to create and disseminate so-called correct historical narratives among the people while suppressing the truth about contemporary life and tragedy of that time. In January of 1938, the activities of the Commission were halted, and its publication house was liquidated. This year can be considered by the conclusion of the first Soviet campaign to write the history of factories, and return to this term occurred in the 1950s. Therefore, the termination of this project coincided with the years of the Great Terror. Some employees of the main editorial office and those who worked in the Ukrainian Republic were oppressed, including Volodymyr Chernявsky, Vasil Stroganov, Ivan Klymenko, Samil Lopanch, and others. Party leaders and writers who participated in the work of the commissions on the history of factories and plants also faced oppression. More generally, the goals laid out for the commissions were never achieved. A few works on the history of particular Soviet factories were published, but significantly fewer than planned. Some texts were kept from publication by the censors. The Commission's failure to fulfill the plans was blamed by the actions of saboteurs, Trotsky's nationalist group, who supposedly were involved in local editorial boards and had undermined their work. Soviet campaign on writing history were connected so much with creation the image of the so-called others in USSR. And in this part of my presentation, I would like to point out this in more detail on a specific example, the Evenings of Memoirs held on the Dnipro HES in 1933-1934. So we can see a poster connected with the team of Dnipro HES. First of all, I would like to explain what is Dnipro-HES. Dnipro-HES, it's a Dnieper hydroelectric power station. It's situated in Zaporizhia in the southeast of Ukraine. This plant received its name due to its location on the Dnieper River. It continues to operate. So here we can see the picture how this how Dnipro-HES was opened in 1932. But its construction started in Soviet time in 1927. The story of Dnipro-HES construction was depicted in several films, novels, photos, Soviet newspaper articles, and posters, as we see in the previous slide. The Soviet propaganda considered Dnipro-HES to be the symbol of the first and the second five-year plans and the most outstanding industrialization achievement, not only in the territory of Ukraine, but all over the Soviet Union. Articles about Dnipro-HES were published in Canadian press too. Also, Dnipro-HES was a convenient place where people could construct their biographies from scratch and seem to be so-called lost among other workers. It was an extensive industrial facility with many workers and a high turnover. All these factors led to document checks taken several months and sometimes did not give any results. So people, the Bolsheviks persecuted in their hometowns and villages could be lost or hidden from the Soviet authorities at Dnipro-HES. However, such a strategy of getting lost was a characteristic not only of Dnipro-HES, but also Donbass. According to Hiroaki Kuromiya, Donbass workers could move from mine to mine in a few months and reconstruct their biographies each time. Zaporizhia Press indicates that the commission writing the history of Dnipro-HES held 38 evenings of memoirs. I managed to find 21 transcripts. The transcripts date back to 1933, 1934. The number of participants varied from 8 to 30 people. I would like to draw your attention on how and what the workers shared. Several characteristic features represented by workers' stories. In particular, they are fascinating with the Dnipro-HES, it is a major construction project. The militarization of the workers' stories and the we-they opposition. We meant Soviet workers, new Soviet men. The 1920s, the first half of the 1930s, was a time when Soviet ideologists, for example, Anatoly Lunacharsky, Leon Trotsky, and Maxim Gorky, actively wrote and discussed who should be the new Soviet man. According to Bolsheviks' ideologies, the new man was supposed to have the right origin, so poor, proletarian, to believe in the Communist Party and revolutionary ideals. Not to be an individualist, but to be a part of group. When I say new Soviet man, it also could be translated like Novoradianska людина. And they meant others and included such groups as kulaks, nepmans, priests, former people, those who had deviant behaviors, foreigners. When workers talked about themselves, they constantly focused on their attitude to work. Very often they emphasized that they worked overtime, fulfilling plans ahead of schedule, work on their days on religious holidays. These mentions about religion were connected with inter-religious campaign, which was carried out in the early Soviet time. Also, when the workers told about the work, it was a very military style of language. Very often, when they use such words as struggle, fight, front. It's necessary to admit that the workers always talk about their group. So the Soviet I was part of the Soviet we. In this memoir, the ideal Soviet worker is often contrasted with others. First group of others was so-called national elements. So people who were involved in the national movement of the 1917-1921 in Ukraine. Ukrainian revolution were called national elements, Petluris or Makhnovets. Petlury and Makhno were leaders of the revolutionary movement in certain parts of Ukraine at the time. Makhno also supported the idea of anarchy. I found several references to the Makhnovets in the memoirs of Dnipro workers. We can say that it's not weird because military groups of Makhno located on the Zaporizhia region. So it's a place where Dnipro was constructed then. But people who were mentioned in memoirs were not involved in Makhno's groups. Workers called people who had a different form of behavior. For example, there are stories about those who stole something or broke the law. The next group I would like to talk about is Americans who took part in this construction. Then, here in my presentation, I use several pictures. It's pictures of workers who worked at Dnipro at the time. Unfortunately, pictures of evenings of memoirs absent. The image of foreigners in worker stories accumulated all the characteristics they gave to the others. More precisely, they were portrayed not just as different, but as strangers, because Soviet propaganda positioned them as the representatives of the so-called capitalist West, where economic crisis and unemployment reigned. So, according to Soviet propaganda, of course. Soviet propaganda literature of the 1930s glorified the achievements of the Soviet and its proletarian heroes, contrasting them with the decline of Western states. So on the evenings of memoirs, Soviet workers said that the Americans look at us as we were savages, as they imagined that we were barefoot and dirty in shorts during the Civil War. They looked at the USSR as Africa or Australia and treated us like people who could not be trusted with anything. We had to prove with our work that the impression they got was wrong. So it's necessary to add that Americans who worked at Dnipro were engineers. And this is praises of people who were Soviet workers. So in these quotes, we see a prime example of all the possible cliches about the West spread by Soviet propaganda. An intriguing question is born. Where did a simple worker from Dnipro get such a set of characteristics? Soviet propaganda used many tools to influence the people. However, one of the primary sources for the information of ideas and attitudes towards the West were the Soviet newspapers, which created and disseminated images of the enemies and allies of the USSR. International issues and foreign policy were among the main topics on the pages of central and regional press. The next remark about Americans was mentioned in the transcript of an interview organized by the Dnipro Commission with the leader of the female brigade, Zhenya Romanko. Klymenko focuses on how Soviet female workers communicated with foreigners while at lunch. She depicts the behavior of her brigade as exemplary. The workers did not change communist ideals and did not fall under the influence of representatives of the capitalist world. On the contrary, they even managed to re-educate Americans and change their deviant behavior. For example, Romanko refused to drink alcohol and other female workers. Such description moreover, she convinced the foreigners to remove it altogether and not drink in front of the workers. Such description fully reflects the content of the USSR anti-alcohol campaigns. Also, references to alcoholism are not accidental because alcohol abuse, like smoking, according to Soviet postulates, should not be inherent in the new society. As Natalia Lebina notes, the Bolsheviks called alcohol abuse a relic of capitalism and a so-called social disease. Soviet propaganda proclaimed that in the West, people did not have jobs, but in USSR, workers had a lot of opportunities to work. Thus, they did not have a reason to drink. Klymenko also made suitable remarks about dancing, which started after that lunch. She said, they dance, but not foxtrot. The remark about the foxtrot here is not accidental, since the dance that appeared in USSR in 1914 as the Soviet ideology proclaimed in 1920s and early 1930s was a dance of bourgeois Europe. As a result of this project, to write the history of Dnipro-HES were several publications. In 1934 in Russian and in 1935 in Ukrainian, texts dedicated to the construction of Dnipro-HES were published in Kharkiv. The book was called From the History of Dnipro-HES. In 1938, the text mentioned just by one writer, Vladimir Yurezansky, were included in the layout of the Ukrainian collection of the history of factories. However, the collection was not printed. To conclude, we can say about the significant role of these two projects in Sovietization of history and creation of USSR into an empire memory, the term used by Serhiy Yekelchik in his work of the same name. Also, these campaigns showed how these two campaigns showed how memory was used as a tool of implementation of so-called correct version of history. In other words, memoirs should be a clue of truthfulness of Soviet version of history. In the 1920s, campaign to rewrite the history of October Revolution was meant to lead the forgetting the Ukrainian past. The 1930s project on the history of industrial sites was meant to demonstrate the achievements and proliferation of the country of the Soviets. But this project was a sort of a crooked mirror because it exactly coincided with the Holodomor and the oppression of the Ukrainian intelligentsia. The characteristic of Soviet history writing was not only erasing certain events from the historical canvas and revising the way they were treated, but also keeping silent about the here and now. The principles of constructing Soviet history that were established in the 1920s and 1930s continued in the post-war period, especially in shaping the concept of the so-called Great Patriotic War. But these Soviet falsifications came to note after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Holodomor, a forbidden topic in the Soviet Union, has been the subject of comprehensive study by scholars for the past 30 years and has been recognized as a genocide against the Ukrainian nation. The Ukrainian Revolution of 1917-1921 has also been at the top of the scholarly agenda. The work of people denounced as enemies during the Soviet period has been rethought. Many repressed Ukrainians have been exonerated. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Oksana, for such an intellectually stimulating presentation. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions from the audience to discuss. So if you have any questions, feel free to either write them down into the chat box, or you can also use the raise your hand option, and I'll make sure to call on you if you'd like to ask a question. Oh, I see we already have a few hands raised. Okay, Father Bozic, would you like to go ahead with your question?
I didn't have a question because I enjoyed the talk. Those were the hands of clapping, so I was clapping for the speaker. I don't have any particular questions right now, but I'm enjoying the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the clappings then. We appreciate those as well. Well, Oksana, I do have a question that I was personally wondering about, and that is the role of linguistic factor in 20s and 30s, and actually the languages that were being employed to disseminate the new Soviet narratives, and how did it evolve from the period of Ukrainization in the 20s and to the repressions of Ukrainian language activists? They're going later into the 30s and 40s.
Thank you so much for this question, because it's really very essential point. and especially when we talk about 1920s, 1930s, and when we talk about these two projects, we can see how attitude to language was changed, because when we talk about 1920s, of course, it's the time of Ukrainization campaign, and we can see that this Journal of Ukrainian is part, Chronicle of Revolution. Firstly, so during first maybe several years, it was published in Ukraine in Russian. Then after 1922, it was changed and Ukrainian. But when we talk about 1930s, most memoirs which were published in Russian. So, but it's important to say also about language, how people spoke at the evenings of memoir. So very often it's a mix of Ukrainian and language and Russian languages, and also when we talk about language, we can use such a term like in Ukrainian, it's Novomova or Novoyaz in Russian, or some researchers translated it's like a new speak. So it's in my presentation, I admitted such main characteristics of this style. So it's like militarization, it's this oppression, we, they, and it's very interesting how people learn to talk, to speak in such ways. So we can say that, of course, it's Soviet propaganda. So they hear different speeches of Soviet leaders, so they could read some newspapers. Yes, so they could understand how to talk. Very often they could understand, and very often they could just you know, copy paste these phrases without understanding what this really means. Also, it's when we talk about language, it's very interesting point of Stephen Kotkin that people try to demonstrate that they believe in the Soviet postulates, and just they tried to demonstrate it, and sometimes they didn't believe in it, and it could be caused by propaganda also, but also it's about the time, so 1940s, and when so many repressions happened, the Great Terror, and people understood what is better to hide in their autobiographies, in their stories about their past, and they tried to, I think that very often people used their language not just to, sometimes to survive, sometimes to just to share their stories. But when we talk about language at the time, we also should admit that this period, 1920s especially, many people couldn't read and write. So it just when they hear something and they copied these phrases. So I think that it's very yeah, it's a very interesting question, but on the other hand, it's also a very complicated question, because different styles in culture, yeah, so it's not just socialist realism of 1940s, but 1920s, it's avant-garde, and it's also influence. Thank you.
Thank you for highlighting this. It sounds like a typical case of Orwellian doublethink, where on the one hand, certain terms are being used without a lot of understanding until, unfortunately, eventually they become quite natural to those who happen to employ them. Oh, I can see Pani Olana has a question.
Pani Olga has a question.
Okay.
Hi, Pani Oksana. I'm very grateful for such interesting reports. Thank you. And I'm very interested in the history of Ukraine, and especially some covering women's issues which are related to the period. And I would like to ask you, do you have any statistic data about female workers, number of female workers, for example, who built Dnipro HES? Because you mentioned previously about the lunch and dances.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's very interesting. Again, it's very interesting question. I hope not just for me, but for other people too. About female workers. Yeah, for example, such research like Anne Rosweiler, she works with autobiographies and tried to understood to collect how many female workers work there. But unfortunately, we couldn't say I can't be sure about statistics, about data, because for example, some women could work just several months. Some women could work since 1927 and the next 5 years until 1932. And for example, when I mentioned about Romanko case, so her brigade included nine women. So as I remember correctly, there were 2 women brigade, but they didn't work the whole time, didn't work this 5 years. So it's really difficult to say, because some workers, some women work like they work at canteens, at not at construction. So, but they also said that we are worked at Dnipro HES construction, but they didn't work like other workers. And just so how we can say about that is, data, because how to recognize who were like typical workers and who work on other workers in Dnipro HES construction. But on other hand, if I have time, I would like to tell more about women in Dnipro HES, that there was a special evenings of memoirs for women, and they came to this event and shared their stories, and it's very interesting how they what they told. And I can agree with this statement, this point of Olena Styashkina, that for women, October Revolution was not important point in their life, so they didn't mention about it. So on other hand, we can see that Istpar created such huge campaign to implement this pattern, that October Revolution was so important for everybody in Soviet Union. But on the other hand, when we read the stenograms, we can see that women didn't mention about it. They tried to emphasize that when they began to work, it was the main point in their life. So they said that before it, I was a dark, stupid housewife, and then I became, I became a nice person, And it was, in Russian, in original, it was sympatичный человек. So it's like how work changed their life. And of course, we can see that very often it's again about propaganda. So they just said what they heard around them. And on the other hand, of course, they could believe in these postulates, especially women who came to work at Dnipro HES. A lot of them were so young. For example, Zhenya Romanko was around 20-23 years old at the time. So it demonstrated that this generation who worked at Dnipro HES and women's didn't remember this previous time, so this imperial time, and they accepted these beliefs easier. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oksana, you have raised very interesting points about a general disinterest of Soviet intellectual leaders in anything personal, including personal tragedy, and any hints of individualism had to be erased because we all want to collectivize, not only economically, but socially, mentally, and otherwise, which I would say goes quite against the Ukrainian values. So how did the Sovietization of history affect Ukrainian national identity and self-perception during the 20s, 30s, and going forward up to modern times?
Thank you. So it's it's very essential, but we can see that these two campaigns influence in such ways that this national identity should be changed to class identity. Yes, so just people should tell about their past, about their origins, but not about their identity, national identity. And so we can see that it was according to Communist Manifesto, that national history is not important, just class struggle. And but I think that these two campaigns taught people to forget their national identity, their past. But on other hand, in Ukraine, there was national movements, and it's not just about national movements during Ukrainian Revolution, but also it's about national movement on the west of Ukraine. In my presentation, I didn't talk about it because at the time it was not included in Soviet Ukraine. But I think that these campaigns, oppressed national identity, but people talked about it, and especially I think it was very important in culture. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really insightful. And Pani Olena, another Olena has a question.
Didn't hear.
Sorry, you have to unmute yourself. You should be able to do it.
Sure. Oksana, very interesting talk. Thank you so much. I have several questions. The first question is, well, this history of factories, it looks like a very fascinating project. And did it have any kind of blueprints? Let's say, was it really purely sort of like, well, a Soviet idea to create a history of factories? Or did somebody come up with this idea relying on the blueprints that were created somewhere else? Then the second question concerns the dates. So you mentioned in your presentation, you used the terms October Revolution and the Civil War in Russia, and then you used the revolution in Ukraine from 1917, 1921. So how do you date the Ukrainian Revolution? Do you make the difference? How do you distinguish between the revolutionary period in the former Russian Empire that started with the February Revolution, 1917, and then was followed by the political crisis in the summer, and then the October Revolution. So how do you date the Ukrainian events then, if you don't call the events between late 1917, early 1918, and 1921, the civil war in Ukraine? How do you describe it? And then the third sort of like set of questions, or maybe just the comment is that it's when you were talking about Dnipro, absolutely fascinating material that you present, but and also you quote somebody from, well, I guess from the Soviet side, the impressions that the person gives about the perception of American engineers of the Soviet workers. I think maybe it's worthwhile to put this in comparative context, because at the time when Dnipro was being built, there was this enormous project in the United States, the construction of the Hoover Dam. And it was really saving the lives of so many Americans who were traveling to the West to build the Hoover Dam, lived with their families in tents, like really like setting up new settlements, you know, like for thousands, dozens of thousands of workers relocated from across the United States because it was in deep economic crisis. And so it was really sort of like life-saving. But it would be really interesting, like sort of like, well, to compare, well, this sort of like, well, social perceptions that existed in the America of the day and in the Soviet Union. Obviously, the proletarians from the working class from the United States couldn't move to sort of like, well, across this the ocean to build anything sort of like in the Soviet Union. So the perceptions that, let's say, the workers had of the Americans, right? They could be really twisted. It would be interesting to see like whether the Americans left there any perceptions of the Soviet working class at that time, but also like really to compare maybe, I mean, maybe it's not a project for you, but it would be really interesting sort of like to make a reference like that it's, you know, across the ocean, you had a similar construction and it's a pride of America. And it's sort of like, it's still sort of like the symbol of, you know, of what engineering can come up with in it in the United States. Yeah, so these are sort of like, well, 3 blocks of questions and comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So about first question, if I would like to ask if I understood correctly that you asked that it's not like just Soviet idea and similar projects in the world about history of factories.
I just have no idea, but I mean, it just seems to be like a fascinating sort of like idea to start writing the history of factories.
Yeah, thank you so much, because really there are, we can say about 2 projects on writing the history of factories, which one of them was called in US. So, but it was not like huge state project like history of factories in USSR. So it's in US, there was a business journal, and they published some papers, articles about factories in US, and I don't remember well about this project, to be honest. I just remember that they also created such publications that should demonstrate, that should share information about factories and plants in US. Also, at that time in 1930s in Germany, there was a similar project about factories. So groups, factories. I don't remember how it's called in German, but yeah, they had like campaign on writing the histories of German factories. I read about it several, I know, years ago, I don't remember details, but it's very important. But when we talk about factories, this campaign on writing the history of factories, we can say that just Soviet unique idea to write about factories. It's about that time. Also, when we talk about this memoirs, one similar campaign took place in US at the beginning of 20th century. So when, if I remember correctly, writers had to collect autobiographies of native people, Native Americans, and yeah, it's about beginning of 20th century. So when we talk about history, this campaign of history of factories in Soviet Union, we can see that it's like, of course, it's influence of other countries, but of course, Soviet ideology said that in other campaigns, they told a lot about creators of these factories, about capitalists. And in our project, we talk about workers, about people. So it's different explanations, yeah, and different points. Next point about Ukrainian revolution. So when in Ukraine, during maybe last 10 or 15 years, we have a lot of discussions how to, what terms is the best variant about dates. And for example, Hrytsak said that we can start with 1914 until 1922. Other researchers also approach other dates. But in my opinion, we can say that 1917, so when the Central Rada was created, so when we talk about national movement, and Central Rada included participants from different political parties, different national minorities, and it's like was very important point in Ukrainian history. And 1921 is a time when last Ukrainian military organization were liquidated. So, like, it's about Ukrainian military army, I mean. I know that there are different discussions that Ukrainian revolution should be discussed in the term of the civil war, but I think that it's better to discuss about these terms with researchers who do research exactly about Ukrainian revolution, because in my research I talk about memory and the Soviet memory, but I think that we can say civil war in Ukraine at the time, because I think, in my point, we should, in my opinion, we should talk more about national movement at the time, and who these people who fought against Bolsheviks too. And about Americans, yeah, so I didn't compare, for example, Ukrainian or Soviet industrial facilities with American, because it was not my purpose. But yeah, it's very interesting because, yes, this Hoover Dam, if I remember, it's Arizona. Yes, so it's it was opened in 1933. If I remember correctly, I'm not sure, but yeah, at the time. So it's very interesting, yeah, maybe to compare these methods, how people decided to go to work there, in general. But when I talk about Dnipro-HES, on my mind, it's better to compare with other Soviet industrial facilities, for example, Belomor Canal, or in Ukraine, it's about Donbass or plants in Kharkiv. So, but yeah, maybe this idea about American factories, like for future. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana, for this fascinating talk. Unfortunately, we are running a bit over time, So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here today and also throughout this academic year. This was the last lecture this academic year, but we hope to see you back in September. So please stay tuned for more events in the future and have a nice summer. Thank you, everyone.